Most losses in UFC history. Jimmy Stevens holds one of the most unfortunate records in UFC history. The most losses in the promotion's history with 18 defeats. And watching his career has been like seeing a tough warrior who just couldn't catch the breaks he needed to reach the top. Stevens was known as one of the hardest hitters in the featherweight and lightweight divisions, with knockout power that could end any fight with a single shot. But despite his dangerous striking, he accumulated 18 losses against elite competition throughout his long UFC career. The veteran fighter's record of 18 losses came against top-level competition, showing that while he had the skills to compete with anyone, he often came up short in the biggest moments of his fights. What made Stevens so frustrating to watch was that he was always dangerous and could hurt anyone he fought, but he couldn't consistently put together the performances needed to beat elite-level opponents. Stevens' defeats weren't due to lack of heart or effort. They came against some of the best fighters in the world, including future champions and top contenders who recognized his knockout power and fought accordingly. The most tragic aspect of Stevens' record is that it overshadows his incredible knockout power and his willingness to fight anyone in the UFC put in front of him throughout his long career. Stevens' later fights showed a warrior who was still dangerous but had absorbed too much damage over the years, making it harder for him to compete with younger, fresher opponents. The psychological impact of accumulating 18 losses was evident in Stevens' later interviews, where he remained confident in his abilities but acknowledged the challenges of competing at the highest level for so long. Stevens' record of 18 UFC losses serves as a reminder that even the most dangerous fighters can struggle to reach championship level in the ultra-competitive world of the UFC. By the way, if you think Stevens' record is tough, wait until you see what happened to fighters who couldn't finish anyone. Hit subscribe for more videos like this. Fastest knockout loss. Ben Askren holds the record for the fastest knockout loss in UFC history, getting knocked out by Jorge Masvidal's flying knee just 5 seconds into their fight at UFC 239. Askren's game plan was predictable. Shoot for an immediate takedown and use his wrestling to control the fight. But Masvidal read it perfectly and had the counter ready from the opening bell. The knockout was so fast that many fans missed it live. Askren shot for the takedown, ran straight into Masvidal's flying knee and was unconscious before he hit the ground. What made this record so devastating for Askren was that it happened on one of the biggest cards of the year, with millions of people watching him get knocked out in the most spectacular fashion possible. Askren had been talking trash about Masvidal and other strikers, claiming that wrestling would always beat striking. The 5-second knockout made him look foolish and ended his trash-talking career. The speed of the knockout meant that Askren never had a chance to implement his game plan or show any of his skills. He went from confident trash talker to unconscious victim in the blink of an eye. The psychological impact of such a fast knockout was evident in Askren's subsequent fights. He seemed hesitant to shoot for takedowns and appeared to be thinking about getting countered. Askren's record became a meme and a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too predictable in MMA. His one-dimensional approach was exposed in the most brutal way possible. The knockout was so clean and devastating that it ended Askren's UFC career after just 2 fights. He went from highly touted prospect to retired fighter in less than a year. Askren's 5-second knockout loss will forever be remembered as one of the most spectacular finishes in UFC history, but for all the wrong reasons from his perspective. Most fights without a finish. Elias Theodorou holds the dubious record of most UFC fights without ever scoring a finish, going 8-3 in the promotion without ever knocking out or submitting a single opponent. Theodorou's fighting style was the definition of safe and boring. He'd use his reach and movement to win rounds on the scorecards without ever taking risks or going for the kill when he had opponents hurt. What made Theodorou's record so frustrating for fans was that he had the skills to finish fights but chose not to. He'd get opponents in trouble, then back off, content to cruise to a decision victory. The Canadian fighter's approach to fighting was purely tactical, focusing on winning rounds rather than finishing fights. While effective for his record, it made him one of the least exciting fighters on the roster. Theodorou's lack of finishing ability wasn't due to a lack of power or technique. It was a mental approach that prioritized safety over excitement. He'd rather win boring decisions than risk losing by going for finishes. The most telling aspect of Theodorou's record is that he never even came close to finishing anyone. His fights would follow the same pattern: early aggression followed by safe point fighting for the remainder of the bout. Fans and media consistently criticized Theodorou for his boring style, but he continued to fight the same way throughout his UFC career. His priority was winning, not entertaining. The psychological impact of never finishing fights seemed to affect Theodorou's confidence in later fights. He became even more cautious as his career progressed, making his fights increasingly difficult to watch. Theodorou's record represents everything wrong with modern MMA scoring systems that reward safe, boring fighting over aggressive attempts to finish opponents. His release from the UFC was largely due to fan complaints about his fighting style. proving that sometimes winning isn't enough if you're not entertaining. Most consecutive losses. Tony Ferguson holds the record for most consecutive losses by a former interim champion, losing his final 8 UFC fights in a row in one of the most tragic declines in MMA history. Ferguson's losing streak began in 2020 and continued through 2024, with each loss being more painful to watch than the last. The once great lightweight was getting dominated by fighters from multiple generations. What made Ferguson's losing streak so tragic was that he kept coming back after devastating defeats, hoping to recapture his old form, but each return only added to his embarrassing record. The losses weren't competitive fights where Ferguson was hanging tough. They were one-sided beatings where he looked completely outclassed. His reflexes, speed, and timing were all gone. Ferguson's opponents during his losing streak ranged from elite fighters like Justin Gaethje to up-and-coming prospects, but the result was always the same. He couldn't compete at the UFC level anymore. The most heartbreaking aspect of Ferguson's streak was watching him get hurt in fights. The warrior who once seemed invincible was getting dropped and finished by fighters who wouldn't have lasted a round with Prime Tony. Ferguson's corner and family begged him to retire multiple times during his losing streak, but his pride and love for fighting kept bringing him back for more punishment. The psychological toll of losing 8 straight fights was evident in Ferguson's demeanor. He went from confident contender to defeated fighter who seemed to know that he didn't belong anymore. Ferguson's losing streak became a topic of discussion among MMA media and fans, with many calling for athletic commissions to stop licensing him due to safety concerns. The streak represents one of the most dramatic falls from grace in UFC history, as Ferguson went from interim champion to holding one of the sport's most undesirable records. Most takedowns absorbed in one fight. Abel Trujillo holds the record for most takedowns absorbed in a single UFC fight, getting taken down 21 times by Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 160 in a complete wrestling domination. The 21 takedowns absorbed represented Khabib's relentless pressure and superior wrestling skills, as he was able to take Trujillo down at will throughout the entire 3-round fight. What made Trujillo's record so devastating was he had no answer for Khabib's wrestling attack, getting taken down repeatedly despite knowing exactly what was coming. The 21 takedowns weren't just about control. Khabib used many of them to deliver significant ground-and-pound damage, making this record both statistically and physically punishing for Trujillo. Khabib's 21 takedowns also set the record for most takedowns in a single UFC fight, showcasing the grappling dominance that would later make him lightweight champion. Trujillo's inability to stop Khabib's takedowns became more pronounced as the fight progressed, with his takedown defense completely breaking down over 15 minutes of constant pressure. The psychological impact of getting taken down repeatedly was evident in Trujillo's body language, as he looked increasingly frustrated and defeated with each successful takedown attempt. The fight served as an early showcase of Khabib's suffocating wrestling style that would later dominate the lightweight division and make him one of the most feared grapplers in MMA. The record required Trujillo to survive the full 15 minutes while being taken down consistently, showing both his toughness and his complete inability to solve Khabib's grappling attack. The 21 takedown record serves as a reminder of Khabib's incredible wrestling dominance and how helpless even professional fighters could look against his relentless grappling pressure. Most significant strikes absorbed in one fight. Calvin Kattar holds the record for most significant strikes absorbed in a single UFC fight, taking 445 significant strikes from Max Holloway at UFC on ABC 1 in a historic beatdown. The 445 significant strikes absorbed represented one of the most one-sided striking performances in UFC history, with Holloway landing at will for 25 minutes straight. What made Kattar's record so concerning was that he kept fighting despite taking massive amounts of punishment from one of the best strikers in the sport, showing incredible heart but absorbing dangerous damage. The fight was completely one-sided from start to finish, with Holloway throwing everything in his arsenal while Kattar was on the receiving end of a historic striking clinic. Kattar's willingness to absorb damage and keep fighting was admirable from a warrior standpoint, but dangerous from a health perspective, as he was taking years off his career in one fight. The 445 significant strikes absorbed weren't just volume, they were quality shots from one of the most accurate strikers in MMA, causing visible damage throughout the entire 25-minute fight. Holloway's 445 significant strikes landed also set the record for most strikes landed in a single UFC fight, showcasing his incredible volume and accuracy over 5 rounds. The psychological impact of absorbing so much damage was evident in Kattar's post-fight condition, as he required medical attention and was visibly battered after the beating. Kattar's corner allowed him to continue fighting despite the one-sided nature of the contest, showing the difficult balance between warrior spirit and fighter safety. The 445 significant strikes absorbed remains a record that highlights both incredible toughness and the dangers of absorbing too much punishment in mixed martial arts competition. Most fouls in UFC history. Jon Jones holds the unofficial record for most fouls committed in UFC competition, with a long history of eye pokes, illegal strikes, and other rule violations throughout his career. Jones' eye poke became so frequent that they were practically a signature move. He would extend his fingers towards opponents' faces, often making contact and causing damage or temporary blindness. What made Jones' fouling record so controversial was that he rarely faced serious consequences for his actions. Referees would warn him repeatedly but seldom took points or disqualified him. The most egregious example of Jones' fouling came in his fights with Daniel Cormier, where multiple eye pokes affected the outcome of their encounters. The fouls became part of their rivalry. Jones' illegal strikes included everything from kicks to grounded opponents to illegal knees and elbows. His creativity in finding ways to break rules was matched only by his ability to avoid punishment. The psychological impact of Jones' fouling was significant for his opponents, who had to worry about illegal strikes in addition to his legitimate techniques. This gave him an unfair advantage. Jones' eye pokes were so frequent that opponents began complaining publicly about his tactics. Fighters like Glover Teixeira and Anthony Smith were visibly affected by his illegal strikes. The most frustrating aspect of Jones' fouling record was that he would often claim the illegal strikes were accidental, despite the frequency and pattern of his violations. Jones' dirty fighting tactics became a major talking point among fans and media, with many calling for stricter enforcement of rules when he did compete. The record for most fouls committed highlights the inconsistent officiating in MMA and the advantage that dirty fighters can gain when rules aren't strictly enforced. Longest time between UFC appearances. BJ Penn holds multiple records for long layoffs between UFC fights, including a 4-year gap between his loss to Rory McDonald in 2014 and his return against Ryan Hall in 2018. Penn's extended layoffs were often due to his indecision about retirement and his struggles with motivation outside of fighting. He would announce retirement, then change his mind years later. What made Penn's layoffs so problematic was that he'd return after years away expecting to compete at the same level, but the sport had evolved significantly during his absence. The 4-year layoff between 2014 and 2018 was particularly damaging because Penn returned as an even older, slower version of himself against a new generation of fighters. Penn's long layoffs meant that he missed crucial years of training and development while the sport continued to evolve around him. His skills stagnated while others improved. The psychological impact of extended layoffs was evident in Penn's performances upon return. He looked rusty, hesitant, and unsure of himself in ways that were never apparent in his prime. Penn's pattern of retiring and returning became a running joke among MMA fans, who never knew if his announced retirements were permanent or just temporary breaks. The multiple long layoffs contributed to Penn's declining performance and his record number of losses. He was essentially starting over each time he returned to competition. Penn's layoff record represents the dangers of taking extended breaks from competition in a sport that evolves as quickly as MMA does. The pattern of long layoffs followed by disappointing returns became a cautionary tale for other aging fighters considering similar career paths. Most decisions in title fights. Demetrius Johnson holds the record for most decision victories in UFC title fights, winning 11 of his 12 title defenses by decision rather than finish. Johnson's fighting style was incredibly technical and safe, focusing on winning rounds rather than taking risks to finish opponents. While effective, it made his title reign less exciting for casual fans. What made Johnson's decision record frustrating for the UFC was that his fights, while technically excellent, often failed to generate the excitement needed to build his star power. Johnson's opponents were often so outclassed that they couldn't provide the drama needed for exciting fights. His dominance was so complete that fights became predictable. The flyweight division's lack of knockout power contributed to Johnson's decision record, but his own conservative fighting style was the primary factor in his lack of finishes. Johnson's decision victories were often one-sided, with him clearly winning every round but never going for the kill when he had opponents hurt or in trouble. The psychological impact of Johnson's decision-heavy style was that opponents knew they had to take big risks to beat him, often leading to them getting dominated while trying to force action. Johnson's record number of title fight decisions became a talking point among fans and media, with many criticizing his lack of finishing instinct despite his technical superiority. The UFC's decision to trade Johnson to one championship was partly due to his inability to finish fights and generate excitement despite his incredible skills. Johnson's decision record highlights the tension between technical excellence and entertainment value in modern MMA, showing that winning isn't always enough. Most submission losses. Royce Gracie, the man who introduced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the world and won 3 of the first 4 UFC tournaments, ironically holds one of the most embarrassing submission records in UFC history. Despite being from the most famous grappling family in the world, Gracie was submitted multiple times in his later UFC career. including losses to Matt Hughes and Kazushi Sakuraba that shocked the MMA world. What made Gracie's submission losses so surprising that he was supposed to be the submission expert. Watching him get choked out and tapped out by opponents was like watching a master get beaten at his own game. Gracie's return to the UFC after years away showed that the sport had evolved beyond his original skill set. Fighters had learned to defend against his techniques while developing their own submission games. The most painful submission loss for Gracie came against Matt Hughes, where he was dominated on the ground and eventually submitted by a wrestler who learned jiu-jitsu specifically to beat grapplers like him. Gracie's submission losses represented the evolution of MMA from a style versus style competition to a sport where all fighters needed to be well-rounded in every aspect of fighting. The psychological impact of getting submitted was evident in Gracie's later interviews, where he seemed confused about how fighters had learned to neutralize his ground game so effectively. Gracie's submission record became a symbol of how the sport had moved beyond the early days when one-dimensional fighters could dominate through superior technique in a single area. The irony of the submission pioneer getting submitted by wrestlers and strikers who learned his techniques highlighted the rapid evolution of mixed martial arts. Gracie's submission losses serve as a reminder that no fighter, regardless of their legacy or expertise, is immune to the sport's constant evolution and improvement. Most fights without a title shot. Donald Cowboy Cerrone holds the record for most UFC fights without ever receiving a title shot, competing 36 times in the promotion without ever getting a chance to fight for championship gold. Cerrone's record is particularly frustrating because he defeated numerous top contenders and former champions throughout his career, but could never put together the winning streak needed for a title shot. What made Cerrone's situation so tragic was his willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, at any time. His activity level was unmatched, but his inability to win the biggest fights kept him from title contention. Cerrone would often win several fights in a row, building momentum towards a title shot only to lose a crucial fight that would send him back to the drawing board and reset his title aspirations. The most frustrating aspect of Cerrone's record was that he often performed better against lower-ranked opponents than against elite contenders, suggesting a mental block when the stakes were highest. Cerrone's losses in title eliminator fights became a pattern that defined his career. He would rise to the occasion against most opponents but struggle when a title shot was on the line. Psychological pressure of knowing that each big fight could be his last chance at a title shot seemed to affect Cerrone's performance in crucial moments throughout his career. Cerrone's record for most fights without a title shot represents the cruel reality that being a good fighter isn't always enough to become a champion in the UFC's competitive landscape. Cowboy became beloved by fans for his willingness to fight anyone, but his inability to win when it mattered most kept him from achieving his ultimate goal of becoming champion. Cerrone's career serves as a reminder that timing, matchmaking, and mental toughness in big moments are just as important as skill and activity level in reaching championship status. Most canceled fights. Tony Ferguson holds the unofficial record for most canceled fights in UFC history, with numerous high-profile bouts falling through due to injuries, weight cuts, and other circumstances beyond his control. Ferguson's most famous canceled fight was his lightweight title bout against Khabib Nurmagomedov, which was scheduled and canceled 5 times due to various issues affecting both fighters. What made Ferguson's canceled fight record so frustrating was that many of these fights were for major opportunities, including title shots and main event positions that could have changed his career trajectory. The pattern of canceled fights seemed to follow Ferguson throughout his career, earning him a reputation as an unlucky fighter who couldn't catch a break when it came to big opportunities. Ferguson's weight-cutting issues contributed to several canceled fights, as his extreme methods of making weight sometimes backfired and left him unable to compete on fight day. The psychological impact of having so many fights canceled was evident in Ferguson's interviews, where he would express frustration about his bad luck and missed opportunities. Ferguson's canceled fights often came at crucial moments in his career when he was building momentum toward title shots, trying to bounce back from losses. The most devastating canceled fight for Ferguson was probably his title shot against Khabib, which would have been the biggest fight of his career and his best chance at becoming champion. Ferguson's record of canceled fights highlights the unpredictable nature of MMA and how factors outside of a fighter's control can significantly impact their career trajectory. The pattern of canceled fights became so associated with Ferguson that fans began to expect his big fights to fall through, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of bad luck. Most weight misses. Kevin Gastelum holds one of the most problematic records in UFC history. Multiple weight misses that cost him title shots damaged his reputation as a professional fighter. Gastelum's weight-cutting problems began early in his career and continued throughout. Several high-profile misses that resulted in fight cancellations and lost opportunities. What made Gastelum's weight issues so damaging was they often occurred before his biggest fights, including a canceled title shot against Robert Whittaker due to his inability to make weight. Gastelum's weight misses weren't just minor infractions. They were significant overages that showed a complete inability to manage his diet and cutting process professionally. The most costly weight miss for Gastelum was his failure to make weight for his scheduled title fight, which cost him his shot at the middleweight championship and damaged his standing in the division. Gastelum's weight problems forced him to move up from welterweight to middleweight, but even at the higher weight class, he continued to struggle with making the required limit. The psychological impact of repeated weight misses was evident in Gastelum's performances, as the stress of extreme weight cutting seemed to affect his fighting ability and recovery. Gastelum's weight issues became a running joke among MMA fans, who would bet on whether he would make weight rather than whether he would win his fights. The pattern of weight misses damaged Gastelum's reputation with the UFC, as promoters became hesitant to book him in main events or title fights due to his unreliability. Gastelum's weight-cutting record serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of professional discipline and the consequences of failing to meet basic requirements of competition. If you like learning about these crazy UFC fights and records, hit subscribe for more videos like this.